How do you visualize your ITSM processes? The ITIL framework, like other frameworks, is a documentation-heavy framework, and as such, it is definitely not for the lighthearted. However, when done properly, there is immense value in good documentation. But, and there is always a big but, how does one go about documenting a process in a methodical way? Well, in this episode, we'll take a look at how you can do that. Before we begin though, let's iron out some basics. The difference between process and procedure. Many people use these two terms interchangeably in conversations, but they are two separate documents, each with their own unique purpose. So let's break them down. A process is a 60,000-foot view or a visual representation of a group of activities. Let's assume we have a process that has three separate activities, illustrated in this example as Activity 1, Activity 2, and Activity 3. Now that we have these three activities, let's define what a procedure is and how a procedure relates to an activity. A procedure describes one or more steps that are needed to be executed in order to complete one activity. In this example, each activity has several procedures that are linked in one way or another. Notice the numbering of each procedure. It starts with the activity number, followed by the sequential numbering of each procedure. But we'll get to the numbering in a bit. Also, notice how the arrows go in one direction. With process documentation, it is always a good idea to have your arrows flow in one direction only so it's clear for those who are following it. To help you further understand the difference between process and procedure, let's use an example. Google Maps. Let's say you want to get to point B from point A. You are provided with two pieces of information for this one activity. The information on the right is your process, which is your visual representation, and the information on your left describes how you can accomplish your activity. Since there is only one activity in this process, which is going from point A to point B, the set of procedures, which are basically the turn-by-turn direction, completes the entire process, which is the trip in itself. Just as a side note, if you happen to click on the options provided by Google Maps, your procedures on the left will change accordingly. This is to show that there are many ways you can get to your destination. The same is true for a process if it is depicted as such. Now, let's use what we described previously to define one of the many ITIL processes, incident management. The incident management process has the following activities. And yes, recordation is a word in the English dictionary. Let's decompose the first activity into some procedures. Let's assume that this activity kicks off when we receive a web ticket, which then proceeds to the next procedure, which is to authenticate the user. The procedure then goes on to branch off depending on whether the user is a new user or an existing one. If the user is not new, we proceed to the next activity, which is classification and initial support. The process continues from activity to activity by way of completing procedures within each activity. We can also illustrate this in this activity, a policy that is enforced within a particular procedure. I typically use a dotted line within my documentation. We then put this all in a swims lane and use that lane to depict which role is needed to fulfill these procedures. Remember those procedure numbers I told you about earlier? Well, just because they are written in a sequence does not mean that they are to be executed in that order. They are purely for reference purposes only. For the sake of time, I have grossly simplified this process, but developing a visual illustration for each activity with procedures is quite a lengthy task, with several revisions needed to get the final process close to 100%. Now that we have that squared away, let's take a look at how you should structure your documents for each of your ITSM processes. Each process should have the following documentation structure. You have your process name, of course, followed by what I refer to as the pyramid of documents. The pyramid is used to depict the importance of each document as well as to gauge the amount of time you will need to invest in developing these documents. The higher up the documents are, the more important they are. And the narrower they are in length, the less time that is needed to develop them. At the topmost are your policy documents, followed by your process, then your procedures, your work instructions, and finally your roles and responsibilities. Just to add some fun though, I have equated this to how a military squad's mission instructions, such as a special forces unit, might relate to the documentation structure. So here goes. The policy in the document structure would become their rules of engagement, which dictates when they should open fire and when they shouldn't. The process will be their tactical map or the lay of the land. The procedures will be the tactical plan, which will describe how to execute the mission at hand. And the work instructions will be specific to the weapon each soldier carries, and then that can vary from one soldier to another. And finally, the specialists that are needed for that particular mission. The best part of this documentation structure, if your tool changes, you are most likely only needed to change your work instructions. Everything else stays pretty much the same. Now that we got that squared away as well, let's go back to our overly simplified process diagram that was drawn earlier. One of the many valuable uses of such an approach is to have the ability to obtain something called cycle time. Since we have 3 activities depicted here, we can practically measure the cycle time for activity 1, the cycle time for activity 2, and finally the cycle time for activity 3 by measuring how long it takes to complete each procedure within each activity. You then take the 3 cycle times, A1, A2, A3, and you simply add them up. The number you obtain is your total process time. You can now have a measure that you can use to optimize your process time by either removing, adding, or automating certain procedures within a particular activity. This concept is actually nothing new. This dude right here is Frederick Winslow Taylor, and he was regarded as the father of scientific management. The manual and laborious method spent to study the time it took workers to complete a particular task. His work actually led way to the concept of division of labor. After Frederick came this dude, Henry Ford, who was known for Fordism, the system of mass production. Both of these two pioneers essentially used process optimization to achieve high product output in manufacturing. Now, let's get back to our overly simplified process depiction and summarize what we've learned so far. We can now say that a set of procedures makes one activity, and a set of activities makes one process. So, what are the challenges of such an approach in documenting your ITSM processes? Well, they can be very time consuming to develop, not easily readable or appear to be complex, and can be hard to maintain every time there is a change being made. These are all very good points, but as stated earlier, it is definitely not for the light of heart. And as far as addressing the other 2 points, which were not easily readable and hard to maintain, the reading part just requires a simple guide to be distributed. And to keep your documents well maintained, you should be updating your documents once a month or once a year, or whichever works well for your organization. And it should be part of your governance process anyways. These documents are meant for anyone involved in the process, but the first most important audience member is the process owner, because he or she is responsible for the effectiveness and value provided by the process, followed by the process manager, then the practitioners, and finally the governance board. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe for more videos on ITSM, and feel free to share this with those who you think might find this useful. If you have comments, leave them below. I would love to interact with you.